exactly is it? If you look at some of the issues of security going on in China's neighborhood, one, the South China Sea, the other, the Korean Peninsula, and overall the anti-terrorism activities that China is having with other countries such as SCO countries. Yes. What do you make of these three areas? How do they relate and correlate with one another?
Well, first of all, they're all related to China's security in China's periphery, but they are just different in nature. When we come to talk about Korean Peninsula, essentially it's a nuclear issue of DPRK. The world as a whole acknowledge what China has contributed, but wish China to do more. But how China could do more, that is another issue. In the South China Sea, to a great extent, this question is hyped unnecessarily because, as I pointed out in Shangri-La dialogue, in the Asia Pacific, the first security issue is on land rather than at sea. And then in the sea, there are so many maritime disputes among so many countries, and even among ASEAN countries themselves, probably with the only exception of Brunei, which has resolved its maritime dispute with Malaysia. All the other countries would have disputes with one another.
Right.
So it is not fair to hype China's maritime dispute with some ASEAN claimants.
So what about anti-terrorism, briefly?
Anti-terrorism, that is a major issue for us in the northwest of China, and that is why SCO is very important. It starts with security cooperation, first with the border negotiation, and then addressing the three evil forces. Now it is expanded, but still, as my president has stressed, security is still the first priority.
Professor Lukin, let me go to you. With the three areas of security mentioned in our program as China's neighborhood, what do you make of this overall direction of China when it comes to its security policies and when it comes to its security cooperation with the other countries? What is your observation?
Well, China is a large country, and it's one of the strongest countries in the world. So, of course, it has its own security interests, and it contributes, as Senior Colonel just said, it contributes more and more to solving various security issues, including the Korean nuclear issue and several others. So I think the world would be a better place if China does more in that respect, because I think at this moment it's not active enough. Well, if we think about what it can do, it's kind of a little bit shy country.
Oh,
I would
okay.
say.
Are you shy?
But another thing is how it's going to do it. It should do it in a way that does not disturb its neighbors, for example.
So you think there are concerns about that?
Well, sure, there are concerns, and there are natural concerns because if your neighbor is suddenly becoming very strong, there are maybe not legitimate concerns, but people begin to think how this neighbor is going to use its new force.
Okay.
And China, it is careful, but it should be kind of careful and understanding about it.
Professor Lukin is general in making that statement, and yet I think there are things that can be narrowed down in terms of answering that question. For example, about the South China Sea. Senior Colonel Zhou, during the Shangri-La meeting, you were, in a way, having a rhetorical war, quote unquote, against some of the other panelists on the same issue about the South China Sea. People accusing China, particularly the United States, Japan, Australia, of militarizing in the South China Sea. And how do you see specifically that issue, the militarization, as they say?
A blunt answer is that is nonsense. Because how do you define militarization? If the necessary defense of China on its own controlled islands is described as militarization, and how about the United States, who have, some people say, 600 bases or 800 bases? They are countless because it's a definition of what is a military base. Then can I argue that the United States is militarizing the whole world?
Is that a reasonable argument to you, Professor Lukin?
Well, as I said, any country, especially a big country, should have its reasonable security concerns. But it's of course best. I'm thinking of Russia as well. It's best for this country to do it in a way that does not disturb other countries. Otherwise, because China needs good relations with its neighbors and with other big players. Nobody is ideal in this world, but it needs these relations for economic reform and development. So there should be some kind of balance.
Right, but you know, when you say disturb, but this is an interesting word, because disturb, namely, you have to involve both parties. One is the one who is, quote, to disturb. The other is the party that is, quote, being disturbed. One could try to limit, quote unquote, the possibility of disturbance, and yet one cannot control the other's degree of being so-called disturbed. It sounds philosophical, Professor Lukin, but that's exactly what I'm trying to ask you. That is, what should be the mentality of countries these days in terms of a rising China, in terms of the neighborly security issues in the region, Professor Lukin?
Well,
from Russian perspective,
I'll give you an example. There's a good example of relations between China and Russia. We disturbed each other for a long time. You know, had a long dispute, a territorial dispute, and we had talks for about 30 years on that, beginning in the 1960s. But we managed to solve these problems, and we had mutual concessions and have a good agreement now. So I think it's a good example for other territorial disputes, not only of China with other countries, but with for any country, also for Russia and Japan, for example. You should accept mutual concessions, and in this way solve these problems. You know, because if you don't do that, for example, if Vietnam, let's say, is unhappy about China's policy, it's becoming close to the United States. It's not good for China. But, you know, they used to be enemies, and now they became friends, you know, the United States and Vietnam. Is it good for China? I don't think so.
Let Senior Colonel Zhou answer that question. Is it good for China or bad for China? Is it black and white?
Well, I think, Professor, you have exactly raised a very good point. The good example of how China and Russia have to resolve its territorial dispute through friendly consultation. And this exactly is what China is doing, even with Vietnam. And with this kind of peaceful consultation, China actually has demarcated its maritime boundaries with Vietnam in Beibou Gulf, what is internationally known as Gulf of Tonkin. So China has both goodwill and patience to embark on peaceful negotiation, and its determination to resolve this issue. So you have said the right thing to prove what I said is right.
All right. Before we go, I do want to ask a final question about this specific issue with South China Sea, because Senior Colonel Zhou, you said the other day to the international press that China has proposed earlier to have a joint military exercise with ASEAN countries in the South China Sea. How is that working? Is that going to contribute to what Professor Lukin has called on to China, which is try to limit the type of disturbance and the degrees of disturbance in your neighbors?
Well, that is one of the many measures for China and ASEAN to have competence building, because we have concluded DOC in 2002, and right now we have finished the first draft of COC last month in Guiyang. China and the Philippines actually have kicked off the first round of talks, bilateral talks in South China Sea. Right. So militarily, the militaries are also trying to build up confidence. And this is the one that proposed from China, since we have some problem in the South China Sea. Why don't we do something together?
You got positive response from the other parties?
Yes, all of us have agreed, and this is tentatively earmarked for the next year.
We're going to see how is that going to happen. The other thing, Professor Lukin, of course, in the neighborhood is about the Korean Peninsula. On that, I would also like to introduce to our panel Jim Walsh in Boston, joining us in the United States, Senior Research Associate at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But let me begin with you, Professor Lukin, first. Of course, the Korean Peninsula issue, nuclear issue, is at the top of the agenda for the UN Security Council and many here in China. What is the way out? Is China's so-called double suspension, double track going to be a solution?
Well, frankly, I don't think that there is a solution. I mean, it depends on what you want to solve. There are several...
what do you think should be solved?
Well, the official problem now is called the nuclear issue of the Korean Peninsula. We all the neighbors of North Korea want them to reject nuclear weapons. But unfortunately, it's becoming less and less possible because of the policy of the United States. Because the United States threatens them, and they see examples of other countries like Libya, like Iraq, who gave away their weapons of mass destruction and were immediately attacked after that. So of course they understand that they have no reason to do that.
Okay, security concern of DPRK.
Yes, so China has most influence on that country, but it's also not 100%. We understand that, and I don't think that there is a good solution here. Of course, the only way to go ahead is if all neighbors of North Korea and all these parties who previously took part in six-party talks, if they had a similar position. I think there is now some kind of understanding between the United States and China, and this is very good. And this.
But what would that make of Russia?
Well, Russia is happy would be happy about any kind of peaceful solution. The thing we want last is a military kind of military war happening there, because we're also a neighbor. We have a 45 kilometers border with North Korea. It will be a disaster for our neighboring cities.
Mr. Walsh, according to Professor Lukin coming from Russia, well, there seems to be a good sign. DPRK and the United States seem to try to get to understand each other's position, and yet there is the security concern. So the United States is the one that should give the security guarantee to North Korea. What do you say?
Well, I'm not sure North Korea would believe a security guarantee from the United States, and that's why I think in some ways 4 or 6-party talks are a useful mechanism, because there's going to have to be another country. It's most likely China, but it could be Russia, that acts as a guarantor for any agreement that's reached, a guarantor for North Korea, so that if North Korea does what it's supposed to do, it gets what it wants in return. So I think it's probably going to be another player that does that. Now, I agree that security is a piece of this. Each action, because North Korea appears threatening to South Korea, I assure you. So anytime South Korea and the U.S. do something to improve their defenses, that of course looks threatening to North Korea. So there is what's called in our language here a security dilemma. But that's not what's only going on here. North Korea has had a nuclear weapons program since the mid-1980s, and so it can't all be attributed to the recent activities. Can't be all attributed to the so-called hostile policy. I think we can have negotiations. I think if all the parties have to enter without preconditions, that's sort of the stumbling block right now. But I would advocate we just sit down and start talking, and we don't impose preconditions. And I think we'll get a freeze of some kind if we do that.
Mr. Walsh, we know that he's rather progressive in terms of comparing to his many colleagues in the United States when it comes to solutions of the Korean Peninsula. You can tell that, Professor Lukin. But what is likely to be the role of Russia? Mr. Walsh earlier mentioned it could be China, it could be Russia.
Well, North Korea depends on China, not on Russia. Russia has very small trade, insignificant with North Korea, and almost no influence on it. We had some economic projects, but they all stopped. So we can only support others and do some steps in this direction, but it's not the main role.
Okay, so you're saying you can be go-betweener, but not necessarily the influencer. Is that what you're saying, Professor Lukin?
Yes, more or less.
All right, Mr. Walsh, very briefly from you, you say?
Yeah, very brief. This isn't about economic leverage. What I'm talking about in diplomacy is that politically, Russia could play a role in reassuring North Korea. The economic ties.
Reassuring on North Korea what?
Referencing that at all.
Reassuring on North Korea what, Mr. Walsh?
Yeah, that's interesting.
In other words, if there's an agreement, North Korea has to have confidence that the U.S. will follow through on its promises.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about pressuring North Korea to get an agreement. I'm talking about what you do after an agreement.
Okay.
And there Russia politically, not economically, could help assure
You
North
know-
Korea that if it does what it's supposed to, we will do what we're
You know,
supposed
when
to.
you say that, Professor Lukin is already sitting back, in that position. So what, Professor Lukin, what are you trying to say here?
No. I think what my American colleague is trying to say is that Russia should and China should give North Korea guarantees that it's not going to be attacked if it destroys its nuclear weapons. But what happens if it's still attacked? What are we going to do? To go on war with the United States? That's not very reasonable. I
So
think.
you think that role cannot be
Because the
fulfilled?
United States has done it already twice. It did not fulfill agreement of the Clinton time and then the second time.
Okay, there's certainly-
during when the six-party talks. So if it does fulfill it this time, so what are we going to do?
You know what?
We don't want to go on war with the United States for North Korea. I don't think so.
Not for that reason. Not for that reason. Senior Colonel Zhou, what about you? China has the ultimate interest, according to, some of the reasonings from the two gentlemen over there.
Yes, definitely. We should understand that DPRK has security concern. So when China says talk about its proposal of suspension for suspension, the beauty of this proposal is that it's mutually conditional. It saves face for both sides. And in historically speaking, DPRK once proposed to have a U.S. to suspend its military exercise first. So I believe compared with the possibility or the eventuality of DPRK ICBM finally reaching continental USA, why don't give peace a chance just by allowing this kind of talks to start first? Because the US is much stronger. What harm would you do if you suspend 1-2 exercises? In this way, we solve this problem. We start to solve this problem with chicken and egg discussion.
Okay, but here is the thing, Senior Colonel Zhou, and I have to ask you about this.
Yeah.
We all know what's going on here now in China.
Yeah.
The internal debate about the Korean Peninsula issue. What would that mean, is China's security? Is it about going this way or the other way? What is the ultimate security for China? And that is combined with the ultimate role China could play in the Korean Peninsula issue. What do you make of that?
Well, what do you mean? What is the debate in China?
The debate in China, which is what is China's ultimate security? To be in where it is, still working on the earlier planned policies toward the DPRK together with the other 5 parties of the 6-party talks, or have a very different approach toward the DPRK, very different from the history.
Well, I think China always talk about 2 things. One is stability, other is denuclearization. In the past, we talked more about stability, while now we stress equally almost on the 2 sides of the same coin. And we probably have start to talk more about denuclearization. And this is in line with all the position of all the parties involved, and even with the UN resolution. So China's position is always to have a nuclear-free and war-free Korean Peninsula. That would be at China's best interests.
That's right. And talking about China's best interest in the neighborhood, the security situation, particularly anti-terrorism, Professor Lukin, the role that SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, has been pledging from the very beginning to play is important. What do you think about this? I mean, on the one hand, SCO deals with anti-terrorism issues, but on the other hand, all of these countries, Russia could be included as well, have been active countries on the Belt and Road Initiative. So how is SCO's role been changing so far? How does Russia see that?
Well, SCO is a regional organization. It deals only with problems on the territory or around its area, the countries. It does not deal with Korean issue or any or ASEAN issues. So, but I think it's quite effective in anti-terrorism activities on its territory, because it should be judged by not what happened but what did not happen. The terrorist activities are very low in this area, and there's an anti-terrorist center in Tashkent of SCO, which is, I think, rather effective. And when India and Pakistan join, of course, it can bring some more problems, but I hope that SCO would be a platform for cooperation between, another platform for cooperation between these 2 countries. I don't think that we should talk about them bringing some more problems, but that SCO is an additional platform. Of course, it's not going to deal with specific problems of their members,
Yeah.
but they will talk more to each other. The leaders would meet, and maybe they come to some kind of agreement.
Yeah, Senior Colonel Zhou, what do you think about that? India, Pakistan, we all know their histories. Is SCO inviting trouble into itself, or trying to improvise some solutions to it?
Well, there must be some serious internal discussions before SCO has made a decision to accept these two countries, because nobody wants to bring in trouble, and the trouble between India and Pakistan would not be small. So I assume these two countries should have made a kind of pledge to add vigor rather than trouble to this organization.
Another thing that you should ask to all of you gentlemen, the three of you, is what about now? You see the enlargement of SCO. What is its potential? NATO, Senior Colonel Zhou, for example, recently invited another new member, become 29 countries now, and that is totally about security. So SCO, though, at the very beginning, security, and then political, and then now even economic to a certain extent. How do you compare these two?
And I believe that exactly the value of SCO is that it is not directed against any third party, as is written in the SCO Charter. Because, well, what is the purpose of NATO? NATO is enlarging, but where is the enemy? They would never talk about Russia being the enemy, but without Russia being even a potential enemy. What is the synergy among the 29 countries? To addressing terrorism, yes, they are trying to do that, but terrorism would be too small, right? Therefore, the 29 countries. So SCO is not taking anybody as enemy, and China and Russia are partners rather than allies. So with India and Pakistan joining, SCO definitely becomes much more influential. So that becomes a sharp contrast, probably a new model of a state-to-state relationship, which is different from NATO's.
Mr. Walsh, of course, NATO recently, with the encouragement of President Trump, talking about anti-terrorism, and probably that's the only thing you talk about during the summit there. So will NATO's role evolve as a result?
I think it might. He mentioned both terrorism and immigration, and I don't see NATO doing anything about immigration. That didn't make much sense to me. But I think as long as Russia is active in the Central European front, in Ukraine and in Georgia, there are going to be nervous Europeans who are still going to want NATO to focus some of its efforts and concern on Russia. Let me say, though, that there's some comparison to be made between the two. Obviously, NATO is not only oriented towards a foe, as the general rightly says, but it's also much larger and it has much bigger economies in it. The SCO, two big powers and a couple of small powers. But that's why but what is similar to both is, and the general is right about this, the more you expand, right, if there are too few countries, it's not really significant. Too many countries, and it's very hard to manage. But I think the most exciting prospect here, even though it could be difficult, would be the inclusion of India and Pakistan. Because if you ask me, next to perhaps North Korea, the most dangerous place in the world is South Asia. And if those countries could be brought in a constructive way, that would be a major contribution to security.
Professor Lukin, you only have less than 1 minute left. What do you think about that comparison, NATO and SCO? Ultimately, SCO, where is it going?
Well, it's not legitimate. One should not compare these two organizations, because NATO is a military alliance and SCO is not. It's a regional organization of cooperation. Apart from security, it deals with economic cooperation, cultural exchanges. It should be compared more like with ASEAN, for example. But of course, it's going to become stronger with the inclusion of India and Pakistan, such big countries, and will be probably one of the most influential regional organizations in the world. And because of that, it will be able to better solve problems.